Hi, everyone. Welcome to the next in our Tidelift chats for Upstream. Our theme today is we're talking about what we owe each other. And traditionally in open source, that has meant we owe each other community towards our developers. We owe source code to our users. But increasingly, we're also seeing ourselves as having responsibilities, other responsibilities besides just source code to users. And so today I wanted to chat with Amye Scavarda Perrin, who has thought a lot about how open and the huge wave of privacy laws that we've seen. I mean, I almost want to say recently, but of course, GDPR, the grandparent of them all, is getting almost old in the tooth now. And so I wanted to talk about what kind of privacy, what kind of data thinking do we owe each other? Because that's, I think, a quintessential responsibility to users. So Amye, by way of introduction, has been around the open source space for a long time. I think you said almost 15 years now.
Yeah.
And despite my best efforts to talk her out of it, went to law school anyway, and has thought a fair bit about this question of privacy and open and how that interacts. I want to start with, what first brought you to thinking about this problem?
I mean, in large part, it comes from a space of one, GDPR came up out of the kind of the depths for everybody. And that was 2018. Where it became something oh, we need to be able to be thinking about this, but it's also a conversation that we should have been having a long time ago around both privacy and security in open source, because open source is in large part based on our relationships with each other. We are in relationship to each other as users and consumers and all of that, and privacy is a fundamental part of the relationship and trust. And so that's kind of where I came to it from. I started focusing on it because GDPR rose up and everybody kind of freaked out and needed a chance to be able to think about it from a framework perspective. But I don't think GDPR is the right place to start. It highlighted it and it shone a big light on everybody, but it didn't actually get us towards, I think, anything like harmony around thinking around privacy.
Well, you're derailing me almost. From the beginning here, because
yes,
I think you just made something click for me, actually.
Okay.
Is that part of where so much of open source is rooted in, at some level, almost a fundamental distrust, right? We like having irrevocable licenses, because that way we know we can always trust that the license will not be taken away from us unless we do something stupid.
But you can change a license. You can.
Yeah. Well, it's permanent. So a more positive way of framing that is that open source is rooted in trust. And to your point, privacy can be very much either a trust violating or hopefully a trust creating kind of thing, right?
I mean, so in open source, when you want to be able to kind of implement something, the reason why we like open source is because you can just you can get the car, you open up the hood, and you see everything inside. It doesn't mean that you're going to be able to change all of it immediately, because no one usually has time or inclination to be able to tinker with all of it, but you know what's in there, you know why it's in there. And so the reverse of that is when you end up with a project that's it's something, your data from your users is not being made transparent about how it comes back in. That's the break of trust as far as a open source developer is going. And I may be getting ahead of you as far as where we wanted to go.
No. I think that's I think sometimes for open source developers often, I think of data as something that other people handle, right?
Right.
That
that's not necessarily true, but it is.
But I love where you're going with that, because I think maybe it will ground the rest of our conversation to talk about examples of, and when we were prepping for this, you called out to me this example of the software that phones home to say, hey, this is how many people are using this software, which is something that, is a very understandable and very old. Debian's been doing some variation on that for, since, for 20 some years now, right? So it's very understandable to want to have that kind of data. And yet
if you're not transparent about how you're actually collecting that data and what kind of things are coming in, it's like it's like watching everybody, like the keys to your house kind of thing. Like, are they getting like things that I haven't, like, so for a storage project, for example, like, yeah, you definitely do want to be able to have like some understanding of how people are using it. But the tricky part is, where do you stop? Where are the things that you shouldn't be collecting and bringing back? And for me, like I think it's a really ethical like quandary to be able to wrestle with here, in large part because you want the data to be able to improve how you're using the software because you want to know where people are using it. But at the same time, no one likes being tracked. Like, who actually says yes when like the little pop-ups come up for like the, yeah, sure, use my data, that's fine. Like I don't think it's that many people. Okay, yeah.
Well, I'm actually, now you think about it. So I was at Mozilla when we first implemented that button,
Right.
specifically around, and it was specifically around crash data, right? Which was very valuable for making, for making the product more robust. And I always click yes because as a former QA guy, like that kind of data has been invaluable to making the software I worked on more robust. But yet we also, I mean, again, at Mozilla, we would have crash data come in and it would be like, oh, the site that caused this crash is totally a porn site
or something else, which, right? Yeah. And it's not because, and now we get into metadata as well around like the what else is going on with that and like how, right? And it's very, very tricky to be able to resolve this. I think as far as being able to say like the where the lines are, you want to be able to have the conversation of what data here is useful and what data here is kind of extraneous. That is the really tricky, you're right, exactly. And so like you have a perfect example of it with a site that some people might find offensive.
Right.
Is that something that you want to be able to expose back into your software as well? Or to find out that someone is using that you don't like? It's open source. I don't get a lot of choices around that.
Yeah, well, or simply that, I mean, the range of, some people, when Mozilla, like you submitted a porn site crash report to Mozilla, some people are like, no, I'm really excited to make this porn site work better with Firefox. Other people are like, you know what about me? And that's a
and that's spectrum. It's a spectrum in here.
It's very contextual, right? I mean, that's one of these things that privacy people will tell you, is that context matters so much, and that's very hard when we know so little about our users. It's hard for open to negotiate that in a way that proprietary companies who may have more control over how their software is used.
I mean, and so the way that I solved this over in CNCF, which is where I'm currently working, the CNCF says, like we have a telemetry policy that projects can work through. Like we have something that we can work through with legal to be able to talk about like what data you're getting and why and where that gets stored. But we also encourage projects to just run surveys to be able to narrowly ask the questions that you're looking for. And we don't have any problems with being able to say, hey, here's like, what would you like to see? Because that's something that a crash data thing can't tell you. So that's where I tend to be able to go towards as far as like how to be able to solve this particular problem right now. But that's me right now. And me of like 3 years from now may have a completely different way of being able to solve this. Because I feel like our thinking on this changes a lot based on what's currently going on, like current events, both in development as well as just generally.
Right. I mean, actually, one of the things I was going to ask you about is when I was at Wikipedia, the Snowden slides came out, and there was very quickly a pivot from, oh yeah, certain types of information passing in the clear, non-encrypted, that's fine, it's pretty low risk, to a default of like everything must be encrypted now.
Right.
And I sort of wonder, I mean, I think we know that one of the ways in which open source has a very pragmatic impact on privacy is, are you defaulting to encrypted or not?
Right. And that's something you can tell pretty easily. But because like, so how fast was that shift?
Ooh. Well, I mean, inside Google, it was a matter of weeks by all accounts I heard, right?
Right.
But Inside, I mean, there are some open source projects that still haven't really, I mean, there was a long time, it was hard to get a certificate, right? For a long, so, I mean, it was what, probably 2 years before Let's Encrypt, 2 or 3 years before Let's Encrypt, which is now a Linux Foundation project, right? I think.
It is. Yeah.
This, started as an EFF project because it was very much a privacy forward kind of thing as much as it was a tech forward kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that was there was that very pragmatic step that had to be taken in order to enable that for people, because it wasn't just, there were projects who would like, well, but I would turn this on by default, except literally getting the certificate is a giant pain in the neck, and I can't just cut off my users like that.
Interesting point. It's both a dependency management issue, as far as like, oh crap, I needed a bunch of things to work right before this thing could actually work, but mentally, how long did that take for the team to be able to shift from meh, fine, to, oh my god, everything?
You mean specifically a Wikipedia, or?
Yeah. Look, I'm getting somewhere with this, I promise.
I'm not sure it fully did, right? Wikipedia's response was much more, we should just not collect personal data, right? And Wikipedia, unusually for a lot of projects, can more or less pull that off, right? With the exception mostly of IP addresses.
Yeah.
There's no private DMs. Like literally all interpersonal communication is public, pretty much. There's all the records of editing are public. Like there's pretty much not such a thing as private spaces.
Right.
And so the one thing is sort of readership records, which were already supposed to be being deleted on a regular basis. I think more than anything else, it caused Wikipedia, and it's now been what, 7 years or so, maybe 8. So my memory's a little fuzzy, but my recollection is much more about tightening up those existing policies rather than any kind of sea change, right? It was much more just like, we need to dot our T's, which might
which, yes, yeah, I mean, you could do that too. No, where I'm going with this is, it sounds like that was a cultural change, as far as an outside force came in, something changed in like the general just out there. It wasn't something that happened internally, but you all recognized, man, something really bad could possibly happen. There is a risk here, and culturally, it feels like a matter of weeks, maybe, rather than like, or an overnight thing. And that's where I'm looking at this from a cultural aspect, going, we know about this now. What will we be, where are we going with this? Will there be something else in, like, again, I'm thinking like a 3-year timeline, that is going to come up and is going to say, oh, one way that we've been doing this, like, again, like that kind of heartbeat data. What happens if like that somehow gets breached in a way that we say, oh, we shouldn't be doing this, and then where do we move from there? It feels more cultural than it does driven by any one particular piece of technology.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. Well, I mean, it's cultural in a lot of ways, right? Including in ways that, what the first chat I had today was about who we is. And while we didn't get into that in that chat, there is this question. And one of the things that was very striking about the Snowden debate, especially in the context of Europeans, was how much of that was, oh, well, this is not a thing for us, right? Like there was a set of people who are like, oh, my government doesn't do this. And one of the nice things about the Snowden, one of the nice / scary things about the Snowden was, there were a whole lot of people saying, wait, maybe my government does do this. And I admit to a certain amount of frustration in the GDPR context that GDPR is very explicitly like, EU governments can spy on this stuff. Other governments, not so much, unless they agree to a bunch of rules. I mean, it's complicated, right? But there's definitely a little bit of double standarding there. And so this question of who is we, these cultural shifts that you're talking about can change who we is sometimes very quickly. Right?
And I'm actually going to counter you on like GDPR, like specifically saying it just applies like European citizens just kind of globally, which is the thing that really caught everybody flat-footed, because it turned that we into a global we.
Yeah, well, but the thing is I think where my frustration comes from
Okay.
is not that it's that the conceit is that EU governments are bound by all of these rules.
Okay, yeah, all right. Okay,
Right.
I'll give you
And
that.
so,
Okay.
like, therefore, EU companies don't have to do X, Y, and Z because as Europeans, they're already doing all the right things, right? They don't
Oh,
have to jump through these extra hoops.
yeah.
Whereas we know that EU governments were also spying on people in circumvention of all these rules. And we know EU companies, now, of course, EU companies now have like statutory like
Hmm.
penalties, right? And are paying large fines.
Hmm.
So I don't think, I mean, at any rate, in a limited time, you know what? Actually, let me step back and say one of the things that's like both amazing and frustrating about this topic is that, of course, Amye and I could spend 29 minutes or 29 hours straight talking about this. So I, I promise.
We'll try to be able to avoid too many rabbit holes, but some of them are fun.
But exactly, some of them are fun, and they're, you know, but I mean, they're fun for us as people who are. I mean, neither of us are privacy experts or
No.
gurus exactly, but we have thought about this space more than we're in the 1% as far as having thought about the space for better or for worse.
Yeah.
What kind of, you know, if you were to sit down with a roundtable of open source maintainers, what is the biggest piece of privacy and data related advice you'd give them?
I mean, I think I go towards like the your Wikipedia example of like collect the fewest amount of like data possible. Fewest meaning like very legitimately, what are the things that are key to your project to be able to understand it? Like what really limiting it down towards my absolute like must have things. And then imagine what happens if you don't have it. Just like you got nothing. Would it change anything about what you're doing? Would it change how you're developing? Would it change your roadmap if you just didn't ever have any data coming back in from your project and then see what happens? Like take both options as far as being able to say, okay, here are the things that we would need in order to be able to understand what our users are wanting. Like where like crash data. Crash data is a perfect example of that. But then separately, what would happen if you never had that? And I think it'd be a really interesting thought experiment. And maybe we do this at FOSDEM if it happens ever again. I don't know.
That would be
Wouldn't that be wild?
well, yeah, well, I mean, that crash data one is because actually, I mean, I do think that is it's a very nice acid test because certainly I think in the Mozilla case,
Mhm.
the crash data would like that would have been a very legitimate like sort that the
Right.
engineering team would, I think, correctly have said, no, 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 really, the project will be like substantially worse if we don't have that. Now that begs the question,
Yeah.
okay, but let's think through then, what is it you really need? There's a professor at University of Wisconsin who's done some really interesting research on privacy respecting crash collection,
Ooh. Okay.
but it's got, yeah, but it's got some, you know, it's got some overhead, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And the data is not quite as refined, and there's but it can lead to some creative thinking. Similarly, you know, Google has done, I think, some really interesting research
Mhm.
on how to update machine learning models with learning that happens on the clients in order to have privacy respecting machine learning. And I keep wondering if there's something to be done there with logging. You could potentially do very rich model building
Mhm.
about usage for projects using that kind of approach, right? Where the model of usage gets built up. I don't think anybody's actually used it this way,
I was
right?
gonna
But
say, I'm trying to think of who would be big enough to be able to actually like have that be meaningful, right? Like I
we could
think,
have that conversation offline. I mean, but
yeah,
I think that's something that's, you know, I think the fun thing, one of the fun things for me about open is unintended uses for things, and
resourcefulness, yes.
I
Uh-huh.
suspect we'll see some innovation in that space if developers and maintainers demand it, right? I mean
Right.
it, because I think there's, you know, we it is on. Let me speak about the we again, right? And
Sure.
for a little while, I will pretend that I'm still an open source maintainer, even though it's been a very long time. You know, what we ask of our peers and of our supporting institutions,
Mhm.
right? You know, if Mozilla had been a slightly different kind of organization, I don't mean that in a bad way, just it wasn't really
No.
providing a platform,
Mhm.
right? But if it had been providing a platform, right, if it was the Rust people or the Go people, it would have been very appropriate for them to think about, oh, how do we turn this into a library? How do we do
Yeah.
this crash reporting? And in fact, at the GNOME project, we did do that. So every GNOME application could use our crash reporting system. So when we did do some privacy respecting changes to that, every GNOME application benefited.
Mhm.
So these things can happen. They're not, I think maybe one takeaway for me from our conversation, I'm curious, is where you can defer to experts. And there's the crypto rule of never roll your own crypto. Is there any equivalent of never roll your own privacy? Like, are there references? I mean, you mentioned that CNCF has a telemetry guide, which I didn't
That's
know.
Linux Foundation. Linux
Oh,
Foundation
Linux.
proper.
Oh, it's
Yeah.
all.
Um,
Oh, cool.
yeah, all Linux Foundation. Let me go find it for you because like you're gonna want this. And I keep this one pretty close to hand as well. I'll just drop it into chat as well. No, it's really quite helpful because like Linux Foundation has in fact thought about this. So yes, to answer your question, there is one example right here that I use pretty frequently. And in large part, it's pretty comprehensive. Mostly because like I'm currently in Linux Foundation and all of that. I haven't spent a lot of time being able to look around for other things, but no, don't roll your own. Like get an idea of like how to be able to make sure that it is both available to the like project and that your users know about it. It's a reasonable balance. But I want to go back to something else you said, like maintainers. Like specifically, and I want to kind of tease some of that apart about like what does a maintainer want from a privacy standpoint as well. Right.
In the
Because
sense of like their email address being associated with a project forever and ever and ever and ever, amen.
I mean we're kind of stuck with that with GitHub. Like I think that one is like just Git as just in general has kind of removed that particular piece of the table. But in large part, you also change email addresses like every time you change jobs. So like that's not as meaningful as I think it could be. But from a maintainer's perspective, what did they want as well? And this is
Well,
where I'm going to ask you to put your maintainer shoes back on, just for a minute, not a ton.
I can't. I'm struggling to. I'm struggling to articulate a general answer about this because I'm really hung up on something that stemmed out of my earlier chat today, again about who we are, and so I was chatting with Seth Michael Larson, who's a Python developer, and he's been doing a lot of who is we anyway, right? Scraping data from a variety of sources to show dependency trees that instead of the traditional package to package dependency tree are human to human dependency trees.
Okay.
And
Interesting.
he showed a graphic that had a name on it that I hadn't thought about in a while.
Okay.
And the name is somebody. Actually, I think I'll drive home the point by not naming this name.
Okay.
This person famously dropped off the internet about 11 years ago.
Okay.
They literally took down everything. They deleted their GitHub account. They deleted their website. They deleted their Twitter account. They had written several books. They deleted those books from the internet. This person's apparently fine, raising his family. Last I heard, still working for Google. And yet here his name was showing up in this Python code that a decade later, he was still one of the top contributors to this project. And so when you ask, what do developers want? I don't think most developers want the right to be, I mean, this was a very literal right to be forgotten, right? He just wanted, so before that phrase was popularized, but like, he very literally wanted to just not be on the internet anymore. And here we were resurrecting that in some sense, very that I sort of want to say, oh, I'm sure he doesn't care, except
No, he very much does. And it's about ownership. And this is actually a dynamic about power here. Yeah, this made me one of the more irritating people in my law school class, just so you know. But the question that you have to ask in that particular situation is who gets power and why? And why is that power, right?
Well, I think we found the theme for next year's Upstream. Um,
Yes, of course. Yeah, like I said, like every time that this came up in like law school where there was some sort of dynamic in here around, which happens a lot, around it, like some sort of like rule happening and someone getting maybe a less than ideal outcome, who gets power and why? And in this particular stance, I think this is a little harder to answer because there's an intent from like the person who says, I want my right to privacy to include the works that I have like contributed. And we've seen this in other open source projects as well, where someone gets to a point with the project where they go, I am no longer participating in this work. I'm taking my toys and going home. And then we say, but the GPL, and you contributed under the GPL or whatever it is that you did. And you remember how we talked about those licenses being like permanent and immutable and all of that? Because once you've contributed it, it's no longer yours. It's part of the project, right? Same sort of problem here.
Oh, very much, right? Every once in a while, no, I mean, not super often, but every once in a while you get a Wikipedian who's like, no,
I'm
big
out.
mistake. Delete every article I'm involved in. And we're like, sorry? Sorry, not sorry, right?
Right.
And that is very much, but this goes back to these trade-offs, right? Of how do you engineer a system if every time somebody wanted to just delete their code from above, it would be very hard to base an economy on open source code, right? And the purpose of open source code is not to have a multi-trillion-dollar economy, but it's not the purpose either.
It evolved and it will continue to evolve, but it is that responsibility to each other that I've given you something, take good care of it. Even though later I might change my mind, but you still have to take good care of it. Like that responsibility, again, what we owe to each other doesn't go away.
Yeah, well, but that cuts both ways, right? I mean, there's both the what do we owe these people who contributed in the past and have changed their minds, but on the flip side, what do they owe to the rest of us when they said irrevocable
left pad?
Left pad, for those who are not familiar, left pad was a project that just sort of deleted itself one day
on purpose, very, very intentionally.
Oh, very, very intentionally, broke a whole lot of things because the license, of course, says that we can keep using it, and in fact there are now forks, the code is back up, etc., but nothing in the license said you have to leave it permanently in npm, not PyPI, npm. And so they deleted it from npm. There's nothing that said they couldn't do that, and that, boy, a whole lot of things had never tested with the assumption that a handful of lines of code that left justify some text would
suddenly up and vanish.
Would just suddenly up and vanish, right? And that it's not a privacy question per se, but it does tie into this notion. Well, it's a power question, right? And of course, what do we owe each other is very much a power question at the end of the day, of which privacy is only one aspect of it. And I know again, we could go on talking for hours and hours about this question, and certainly
well, I want to go back to the solo maintainer part, because we talked about like maintainers directly, and now like moving towards like the singular people that are involved, and that's where this gets a little bit more challenging as well, because like the person that you are today may not be the person that you want to be like the tomorrow. Again, like all of these things are really like examples of I want to be forgotten, but yet people I'm thinking it through a little bit, because there is a forgotten, but it's also like the responsibilities of like I put this out here, and to be a responsible maintainer, it should at least stay there in some form. But what if it's full of bugs? Like, yeah, right? You see where I'm going with this? Like, and I'm not totally sold on what the answer is yet.
Yeah, well, no, I don't think. I mean, I think one of the things that unfortunately frustrates a lot of engineers about privacy is the classic lawyer answer of "it depends." Right?
I knew we were going to get there.
Yeah, I mean, systems that have black and white answers, that have yes and no answers, binary answers, are in many ways easier to reason about, right? They're easier to solve for, they're easier to create answers around. Privacy as much as we would like it to be, is very rarely that, especially in a system that has personally identifiable information baked into it from the beginning, which is to say the internet, right?
Yeah.
It's very, if this whole, I mean, to get back to the Wikipedia example, right? It's much easier if Wikipedia didn't literally have to get your IP address in order to serve you a web page. It would be a whole lot easier for Wikipedia to say, we never take your personal information.
That's interesting. Now you want to be able to imagine an internet that wasn't based on identity.
Yeah.
Super important for later. We'll table that one for like another time.
We'll table that one for the 202 version of this lecture, right? Because I do think, to get back to that question of one piece of advice for every solo maintainer, I mean, maybe one thing to think about, right, is beyond just, I mean, because I think your initial advice of, if you could give one piece of privacy is essentially, don't, like, if at all possible, don't collect the data.
Yeah.
And I think maybe an additional and maybe one way to think about this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this from a solo maintainer perspective, is if you feel like you must collect it, consider carefully whether or not you have the capability to govern that data, right?
Yeah.
And
Where are you going to store it? What are you going to do with
it? Where are you going to store it? How reliably do you feel like you could? Because maybe one answer might be, really, I need this data for some reason X, Y, or Z. Can you or your project by default, perhaps even hard-coded, delete it after a week, or delete it after a day, or delete it after an hour if you no longer, I mean, this is one of these things, this is not applicable to every kind of open source project, of course, but for things like blogging software or wiki software, the default on all these things forever, right, including Apache, and I think Apache finally fixed this a little while ago, but the default for Apache was log everything forever and ever and ever and ever, amen. And to make the logging less verbose by default, and to delete by default after a certain amount of time, rather than, was a, like, well, as you said earlier, it's a cultural change, right? So if you're starting a new, especially if you're a solo maintainer who's starting a new project, I would say consider strongly, one, don't collect data, but two, if you must, by default, build in deletion, build in anonymization. Don't,
well, as much as you can, but again, your example of like which website caused it to crash, and like, yeah, why is that happening? I think for solo maintainers, they're not there yet most of the time. I mean, like, if you have a solo project and you're kind of starting off, like, I'd rather that you thought about security and then privacy, like, basically in that order, because one leads to the other, and you're like, leaking private data is in fact a breach of trust, which means that you would then have bigger problems as far as like both your security and your privacy issues, and that's why they get roped in together a lot. But I think the people that we're actually thinking about are let me see if I can describe this more directly. I think we're thinking about the groups that are companies coming into the space, wanting to be involved in the open source ecosystem, and knowing that, like, in order to be able to do this, you have to open source your code, but at the same time wanting that, like, well, how do I drive this beast anyways? And that is where you need like that kind of the data that would come from your users coming in. That's where I tend to go more towards, like, I think going towards surveys, but in order to be able to do that, then you have to know who your users are as well, and that gets right. And its tail, it eats itself.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, I mean, I want to get back to, I mean, I think that's a great point, and that is where best practices around things like this telemetry document that you shared can be really helpful, especially for an engineer at a, bigger companies will often have a privacy attorney on call, perhaps not a, perhaps.
Yes, perhaps, but it's unlikely.
Yeah, well, and you may not ever think about it in the context of open source, right? So if you're an engineer, that's a great resource for educating yourself. I know, Amy, you said you were going to share some more resources, and we'll put those in the talk notes on places that you as an individual can educate yourself. But I do think maybe one of the challenging things about our theme today of what do we owe each other is that we do have to be honest with each other. And I think it's okay for solo maintainers, for all maintainers really, to accept that there are hierarchies of what we owe each other when, and that there are times when it's, I don't want to say cut corners, but that it can be okay to say, I want to learn a little bit about privacy, and I'm going to make sure I don't stub my toe. That's part of why I said, what's the one thing that you'd love for people to hear? And I think that answer was a great one, right? The answer is don't collect it. You can all avoid it, because that and then later, if a project gets bigger, once you, as you say, you've dealt with the security concerns, because I think you're right that is very much top of mind. You can do all the privacy you want, but if you've got security vulnerabilities that bypass some of that privacy work, so that's,
you will then have bigger problems, basically. Yes.
That's right. You will have bigger problems, and that's where what we owe each other sometimes is we don't owe each other burning out. We don't owe each other not starting the project because we're terrified of the burdens.
That's responsible maintainership. We'll get into that one. Like that's a totally different talk. We don't owe each other staying too long. If you are done, be done. Very controversial, that.
Well, that's a whole nother, perhaps we can, perhaps I can, was it you that I was joking about this years ago on Twitter, that I needed to start a how-to guide for the therapists of open source developers? So it was like an intro to when your client, when your patient says, I'm an open source developer, here's what you need to know about A, what the heck does that mean? B, what are the stresses? What are the because we
how it's different from other. I don't think it was you and I joking, but I can definitely I'm fully aligned with that, because explaining the constructs that we have created for each other is very, very difficult to someone that just in the past has a 9-to-5 job. You show up, you do your thing, you go. And where we run into trouble is when we put too many things on a community to be able to be all of the things for each other. And that's a story for another time, because we do form these really tight relationships in here, and these long-standing, the concept of same team, different companies is it's becoming more prevalent in the general outside of open source world, but that's still the world that we live in. And so when you're on same team, different companies, you do have to be able to think about, well, what things can I do to be able to make it better for how we're all thinking about privacy? And I'm getting back to I'm pulling us back from our rabbit hole. It's a good rabbit hole. But understanding that if I do it right on this particular project here, then somebody else will be able to take a look at the work that I've done in terms of how I made decisions for what data I collected, how I did it, how I open sourced it, or how I responsibly disclosed it towards people. And then we get a chance to be able to do it again on the next project, because there's always going to be a next project.
Yeah, there's always going to be a next project. There's always going to be learnings to be shared for better and for worse, right? There's also bad learnings to correct.
Oh, there's definitely bad learnings. I mean, I, as part of preparation for all of this, I went back and found the New York Times privacy project. It was a long opinion thing from 2019, and it's quite scary in that it is both outlining all of the excesses of privacy that hasn't been taken care of and still hasn't been taken care of, and we're now in 2022 and that was 2019, and it's did we get anywhere with this? And I want to believe that we can, but we haven't gotten there yet.
Well, and I mean, I definitely think that like you said, there are cultural shifts, there are changes, there's always new, as with security, there's always new threat models, there's always new, but I do think we're hopefully getting to a better, well, simply the fact that open source conferences are having conversations about privacy. Not as many as we need yet. Open source organizations have metrics policies, have privacy policies. I think that used to be something that we didn't think we needed, and where understandings of defaults are changing. So I'm not a glass half full kind of person as a general matter, as you know. I mean, that's my job as a lawyer, is to be the glass half empty person, but our jobs. But it's but I do think there's really something there. So I think that's actually a great. Oh, go ahead.
I like where this is going towards. I don't think we're there yet. The things that I keep an eye on as far as being able to make sure that I'm not completely behind the curve is the International Association of Privacy Professionals, like actually a thing. They do conferences, they do talks, they write pretty significantly on what changes are happening and why. So if that's a resource that I would kind of keep around for folks as just general, because there are people.
IAPP open source interest group.
In my copious amounts of spare time.
Right. I was going to say I'd have to renew my membership, but it is a IAPP.org, great resource for learning more about a lot of this kind of stuff.
It is bite-sized things. Like that's what I think the best use for maintainers or people that are interested in being able to keep up on privacy without trying to be able to read all of GDPR and CCPA and whatever the next one is coming, because there is a next one. I think I just saw Connecticut.
We could get, there's a whole 50 states worth are coming, and they're all going to be contradictory.
They're going to be different. They're going to be like, oh, it's going to be the best minds in Congress that make all. It's going to be fun. Yeah.
But one pro tip: don't subscribe to IAPP's main RSS feed, because the volume there is terrifying. So just
that's a good and a bad thing, and that like there are lots of people that are interested in this. We are more or less sure that people are going to be keeping an eye on it, and separately, it is not a solved problem. No.
Cool. Well, that is a great note to end on. Thank you so much for your time today, Amye. Really appreciate it.
Such a delight. I really appreciate that Tidelift is willing to be able to have the hard conversations about things that we really need to be responsible about. So,
yeah. Well, great. Thanks so much.
Delighted to have been asked.
Yeah, delighted.